Okay, welcome to another Fat Tony's live Q&A. For those of you that haven't joined us before, so the Fat Tony's Q&As are a chance at the end of a long week to grab a beer, have a drink, and really tune into some conversations with absolutely fascinating people. This week's guest is, originally was the head of compliance and operational risk at UBS, and having pioneered and kind of operating at the intersection of behavioral science and ethics and risk and compliance, went on to form his own consultancy, Human Risk, and he's also the producer and host of the absolutely brilliant Human Risk podcast. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Christian Hunt. Welcome to Fat Tony's, Christian. It's just great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Awesome. For those of you that have never joined a Fat Tony's live Q&A before, it's your chance to speak to Christian. So we're going to be monitoring the Fat Tony's Discord server for all you guys out there. We have a questions channel. Feel free to ask anything you want on there for Christian. We're also going to be monitoring the Fat Tony's Twitter feed. So just at us if you have any questions during the show. Lastly, for those of you joining us on the YouTube live stream, obviously we have a live chat function there. Just ask anything you want. So hopefully we'll try not to throw you too many curveballs, Christian, but it's a really friendly community here. It's all good.
Cool. Well, look, it's absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm talking hopefully about a topic that it will stimulate other people, but certainly stimulates me, and I find fascinating.
So, I suppose to kick off then, one of the things that I find fascinating about you, as opposed to kind of the Rory Sutherlands of the world and Ole Peters, is that you've come to behavioural science as kind of cross-disciplinary approach from a slightly unconventional angle. Now, as someone, I don't think you know this about me, but I worked in finance in London for almost a decade. Investment banks and various investment firms. I have never come across anything close to some kind of internal behavioral sciences team or unit. I'm really interested to hear how that came about at UBS and kind of how you pioneered that.
Yeah, so I'll just start early on in the journey, which is I did a degree that was French and German, and the university I went to meant that was literature-based. Why do anything relevant to the real world? We want to study sort of, and so I mention that purely because I spent my university time reading stories and writing about stories. And so I think there's been something in me that's always been fascinated about people and why they do things. I was one of those irritating kids that was always asking why, and for some reason my parents indulged that. And I think that's always stuck with me. And I mention that again because I went in and did something really weird with hindsight, which is I went to become an accountant. And that was in part to counteract this degree that I've been doing that didn't seem to have any relevance to the real world. Now, I better do something sensible to kind of keep the money coming in over time. So I became an accountant, admittedly in a consulting context. So it wasn't auditing. But I did that and then moved into the city into financial services because, frankly, that paid quite well. And that was interesting. And so began a slow meander into the regulatory space, not by any great planning. I mean, if I were doing a job interview now, I would give you a with hindsight narrative as to why that was the logical thing to do. But at the time, it was just that this is interesting. And where I ended up was post-crisis, and I have to stress this, ended up at the regulator because they were looking for people that weren't typical regulators. They'd kind of been around the sector and they were looking to change the way financial services was regulated in the UK, recognizing that perhaps some of the people that they had in post hadn't been asking necessarily the right questions. And also, to be fair, hadn't been necessarily empowered to ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. And so I became a sort of involuntary regulator and took over this portfolio of international firms in the UK. And so the idea is in this thing called supervision, which is the bit of the regulator that faces off against the outside world. So you can almost think of it as the customer services function or the concierge, but of course it's not servicing those customers, it's keeping a very close eye on them. And 7 days after I took this portfolio of international firms over with a kind of team of people, and you're thinking, where do I even start to look at stuff? Something happened at UBS, which was one of the firms on my watch, which was that there was this rogue trader called Kweku Adeboli, whose handiwork became known. And so I'd started my career as a regulator thinking, well, firstly, they're not going to let the new kid loose on this stuff, right? The adults will come into the room and deal with this. And the second thing is there must be a playbook for rogue traders. And I was wrong on both counts. They literally let me loose on this thing. And most of my career as a regulator was shaped dealing with this issue. And to their credit, by the way, this is not a criticism of the regulator. It's good not to have a playbook, because if you assume that one rogue trader is the same as the previous one, you're missing a whole load of things that you might look at. So I spent most of my career focusing on UBS and really helping to resolve that issue. I became COO at the regulator there, which had then been broken up and part of the Bank of England, the central bank. So I had the sort of COO role there, got to see the inside of central banking. And then really realized I wasn't cut out to be a central banker and was looking for somewhere to go. And the obvious place to go was UBS, because I realized that, one, I knew the firm really well. They knew me. So it was less of a risk on both sides. But the second thing was that you have a choice as a regulator. You can either go to a firm that is trying to do bad things and wants a spin doctor to try and get them away, or you can go somewhere where they actually genuinely want to do the right thing. And look, they had come so close on so many occasions that UBS had to try and do the right thing. And so I joined in this role of compliance and op risk. And for those people not in financial services, compliance is the obvious thing, which is there are some rules, we need to comply with them. We have a function to make sure that that happens. And operational risk is all of the risks that are inherent in banking that are sort of second order risks. They're not directly related to lending or the markets or interest rates. They're the kind of cyber risk, anything that might go wrong. And so as I was covering one of the businesses for UBS and on a global basis for that, what I realized was that many of the things that were happening, and they were happening in my name. So for example, I would get emails from myself inviting myself onto training courses, really weird, or policies. I would be telling myself about, the machine would spew out these emails that would come from me to me. And I would read this and go, what is this? And I had to do a load of training courses that I didn't think were necessarily getting to the point. And I started to recognize that we weren't landing the message with the target audience. And I recognized it wasn't landing with me. And I felt with my background, and I knew where it was all coming from, that wasn't a comfortable place to be, particularly as I'd been the person at the regulator that had created many of these rules. And so, and by the way, I should add, this is not a criticism of UBS. This is a common thing across many companies that they behave in this way, which is kind of we've had a problem, or we've had a number, we've got to respond to a regulatory ask, or even just a perceived societal ask, and we do that in a certain way. And what I realized was that with both of my hats, we were very heavily involved in the business of influencing human decision making, because you can't just say to an organization, be compliant. You can't just manage risk by thinking about it theoretically. What goes wrong is human beings not doing the things you need them to do, or doing things you don't want them to do. And so as I looked at that, I suddenly thought, well, actually, hold on, if we're in that business, we're going about this in a really interesting way, which is we're just assuming, for example, that if I put it in a policy, you'll read it. If I send you on training that I think is necessary, you will be excited by this prospect and engage with it. And so as I looked at that challenge, I realized that we really weren't landing with the people on the ground. And being an adult at this stage of my career, I decided that the solution of ignoring it really wasn't available to me. And I wanted to do something about it. And so I looked for solutions. And then I come back to that literature degree and my curiosity as a child. And I suddenly just went, well, if this is about influencing people, we should think about what actually drives people in the real world, and what can we learn from other contexts. And that led me to other people that were also in the business of influencing human decision making. So most obviously advertisers, governments, transport authorities, ton of other industries where in just totally different contexts, but they were trying to do the same thing. And if you transplanted what we were doing into those other worlds or vice versa, it felt like a totally different game. And so I started to think, well, if we want to get this right, we need to get people on side. How do we do that? Well, let's just shamelessly borrow from other people that are good at this and use those techniques. And so I started to do that in a kind of slightly stealthily manner, because I just sort of went, well, I'm just going to change it. Let's just try this stuff. And so in a large organization, when you're running a function, in theory, you have lots of power. And I did for certain things, but there's also a machine that also tells you what you need to do. And so I was simultaneously playing in my own sandpit and chase the bits I could, but whilst trying to influence the machine. Anyway, what I discovered was that if you actually start to think about this risk management piece as the challenge of influencing humans, you suddenly have this toolkit available to you that you wouldn't ordinarily think of, because some of it feels slightly unserious. It feels inappropriate. It's just a ton of techniques that you wouldn't have considered. Or you can step out of the mold of, actually, we tend to solve problems by doing the same thing. And typically in organizations, it's like, I'm going to tell you to do this and you will do it. And that works in certain circumstances and is appropriate in certain circumstances, just not in all of them. And so I started to look at this piece. Anyway, cutting a long story short, I was really pushing this theme, and my boss just turned around to me and went, how do you fancy doing this for the firm as a whole? And so began an amazing career move, which I would encourage anyone to try at your own risk, of course, which is push something and see what happens. And so I pushed it and so I had that opportunity, and then recognized, having done that within the firm for a while, that actually this was a common problem. And even in industries where we think they're really good at this stuff, and some people are in certain contexts, there was an opportunity to go more broadly. So I took the show on the road, and now I work with a cross-section of different industries, usually regulated, but not always, to think about how we solve this problem of trying to get our employees to behave in a particular way to mitigate the risks that they pose.
So what were some of the kind of like early examples of things that, where you were doing something and you changed it for something that was a bit more behavioral based, and actually it actually worked?
So really, my favorite example was something I inherited, which was a review process that had been instituted for marketing materials. And so what we mean by marketing materials in that context is anything that's going out to advertise the product. So it might be brochures, it might be website design, it might be a TV ad, newspaper ad, any of those things. And somebody had instituted at some point a policy that basically said, you can't really send this stuff without compliance approval. And on the face of it, that sounds really logical, right? Because the risks of you putting an advertisement that misleads people, well, we've all seen what happens. So there was this process where they said compliance needs to review it. And this was incredibly time consuming, incredibly costly in terms of man and woman hours. But also, stuff would come at you at random. You can imagine the amount of stuff that comes at you Friday, 5 o'clock, right? Oh, Christ, we need to get that approval. Let's offload to them. And so I looked at this as I was looking at what my people were doing and just went, this feels like a very cumbersome process in terms of the amount of effort. And I thought about, does it do what we think it does? And what's really interesting, if you think about it, if your job is creating marketing materials and you know that there's a risk out there and you know somebody else is going to check it, your natural tendency is to go, awesome, right? I now have the experts checking this stuff. So I am going to push the envelope because they're providing a safety net. Mm-hmm. And so that's very logical from that perspective. And of course you think, well, of course you are providing a safety net, except for the fact, and this is where behavioral science comes in, that what the compliance person is checking when it runs on the desk is what they've got in front of them. So I can read an advertisement or a product, some sort of pamphlet around a product, and what it'll tell me is what they want to tell me. I have absolutely no clue what they haven't said but could have done. And if you think about one of the biggest risks in financial services, it's not what you disclose, it's what you haven't disclosed. And so we were sitting there with a control that on the one hand encouraged people to take more risk. On the other hand, we were blind to some of the risks. So actually, it wasn't mitigating the thing it was supposed to mitigate. It was hugely time consuming, irritated the hell out of everybody, because you can imagine the business going, oh, we've got to get it approved by someone. Compliance is going, oh God, here's another random thing that's landing on my desk. And of course, it's always under massive amounts of time pressure. And we know that human beings are not at their best in those circumstances. So there's something that looked really good, was incredibly expensive. And actually, I don't think mitigated the key risk. So I thought, well, what can we do about that? Well, the answer is you need to put people in a position where they're taking the risk themselves. Whether if you're creating the material, you own it. So how do we do that? Well, we pull back. We ironically do less control. We maybe do spot checks. We think about giving people a form of qualification. So if you want to be free to release marketing materials at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'll give you some form of qualification that allows you to do that. We can identify higher risk and lower risk. And so maybe there's some things where we just allow it to go out the door, other things we don't. And we start to look at it as a risk problem. And so I fundamentally shifted that dynamic and ironically took something away that felt really secure, but in practice was utterly useless. And as I started to look across all of the things that we were doing, there were plenty of examples of things, if you thought about it from a psychological perspective, were not achieving anywhere near the level of certainty that they were, the people endowing it when they looked at the process.
Exactly. It's almost like a fence paradox kind of thing, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. As soon as you start treating people as actual people and not as like little cogs or machines, they start, then it starts to actually make some sense. And suddenly having the fence kind of ruins things.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think it's also just, there's a supreme amount of comfort in adding controls. So every single time something goes wrong, let's do more of that thing that we were doing before, rather than questioning, was that thing a good idea in the first place? And I think in some, by the way, in some cases, it wasn't just another pair of eyes, it was another 2 pairs of eyes, which again doubles that. So the 4 eyes check within the compliance doubled that problem within the compliance space, because neither of the people that were looking at it were thinking, well, I don't really have to do this because he or she's done it. Yeah. So it's, there is this additive. I'm fascinated by this idea of we constantly add things. We add new systems, we add new processes, we add new rules, when actually maybe just maybe if we got rid of things, that might also achieve an objective. But of course, this is counterintuitive thinking. And so one of the interesting things is, if you're the person that has designed that system, and sometimes you don't know within an organization when you're criticizing, if the architect is still around and maybe even part of the process, they are going to put up resistance to that, because firstly, it's criticism of them, but secondly, they're worried about their career. And it's an implicit criticism that they've been wasting their time all these years. So that's another psychological aspect of this. You can't just look at the control and say, I'm going to scrap it. You have to think about the psychology, not just of the target audience, but of the people doing the control, and how did we get here?
So going back to a little bit about your career then. So obviously behavioral science is a relatively new field. And when you were sort of implementing this at UBS and human risk now, so to what extent are you tinkering and experimenting yourself versus kind of using behavioral science case studies and things that have been proven before?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is that in an ideal world, what you do is you say, look, I don't know what's going to work and I need to test it out. So you would be going for the sort of classic scientific approach to this. So we'll run experiments, we'll do randomized control trials, we'll try various treatments, see which one performs best, and we'll implement that. And that's lovely if you can do that. And there's a ton of reasons why you can't do that. The first of which being, if you're coming in and challenging the narrative of, hey, I think what you're doing is really crap, and I've got a suggestion for something that might be better, doesn't particularly fly in the world of kind of, fighting orthodoxy. And so very often it's a case of you have to do what you can. So where it was possible to try things out, because the people you were talking to recognized that actually maybe what they were doing wasn't great. And that's easier to do when they're not the ones that have designed it. Or if they've had a massive blow up, if something's gone wrong in a space, you can easily come in and go, I'm not sure you've got this nailed down. Let's try and do it a different way. But if you're working with people where you think it's not great, but they are motivated to think it is, you've got much less room to move. And so I was doing a combination of coming in and almost identifying things that were so obviously a bad idea. A process that if you want somebody to do something on a regular basis and they're having to engage in 20 minutes of nonsense logins to tedious systems that are really unclear, I can kind of point out that's not helpful. Ditto, if you expect someone to read a 300-page policy before they're allowed to do something, that I just know from any other context in the world, that's not something that is likely to succeed if what they're reading is really important. And so what I'd be doing is working out what the ability, and some of this was IT, right? So a lot of the things that we see in organizations nowadays is somebody somewhere has designed a system without a thought that they might need to change it. And so there were a few things that I wanted to do, which were really simple ideas like, can we just change one word in an email? So classic kind of behavioral science stuff. And that works very, very effective in certain contexts, but you need to test it to make absolutely certain. And so I tried to change, I said, actually, the wording we're using on this email seems to me to be aggressive or unhelpful. I mean, even just using the word compliance in an email subject line, right? You kind of think evidence points towards the fact that may not be the top of people's priority list to open it, and you're not in Marie Kondo language sparking joy as they do so, right? So I would suggest that removing that might be a good idea. You don't need to use that word, and it's all people use it. We will use the word compliance because it confers authority. And I said, they go, you are scaring the crap out of people. Let's not do that.
Yeah,
let's
straight on as offensive.
Yeah, right. And it's a little bit like anytime you get a letter from the tax authorities. I don't know why they put their logo on the facto in the UK because I just look at it and go,
licensing.
Yeah, right. And it's you just sort of go, this is not going to be joyous. Nothing about this screams opening this envelope is going to bring me anything positive. So there was a suggestion where I thought perhaps we could just remove that word as a simple experiment. Now you would think that actually that would be relatively light touch and people might go for it. No, couldn't be done very cheaply because it was spewed out by a system. Somebody had bought into some sort of training package or communications package. And what they had done is they will allow you 5 changes. And those changes had been used up in the first few weeks through spelling mistakes. So literally to remove the word compliance from an email subject line was something like £50,000. Now, I'm pretty confident it would have an impact. I'm not totally sure that I want to stake a £50,000 bet on that.
Yeah. Why aren't we all in that business? Right. So I want to know. It's ridiculous.
I think it's the way vendors sell it, and why. And possibly again, it's their. It may not be the firm systems. It may be the systems of the provider. Who knows? But anyway, that's a really silly example of a practical obstacle that just goes I'm not like you can push it sometimes, but that's not a hill I'm willing to die on. So in that case, I would say let's try and work around that. But there were other things where people were more amenable to it, where experimentation was moderate. And you've got to also remember that in a regulated environment, the things that people care most about, generally speaking, is stuff that they think, and perception again really important, that the regulator is going to care about. So if I always saw the lowest hanging fruit was going to be things that were really important. Because actually that's the stuff you really need people to do. But you start messing around with things that feels like it's really significant and important to people whose job is running that process. And they're like, I'm not having this clown coming in and touching my processes because that'll get me into trouble. Now, often it's not true. And having been at the regulator, I can make a certain strong argument to kind of countermand that, but it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. So you sort of pick your battles and you recognize that actually, if I'm going to preach the language of behavioral science and talking about how do we influence the target audience at the end of the game, I've also got to do the same thing for the people that I'm trying to persuade. And I have to be persuasive there. And if I look like a bull in a china shop, then that's not going to, it doesn't send a signal to them that I'm open for engaging their target audience.
I think a lot of this really resonates with me, Christian, because my experience of what I would call compliance training in the finance industry, and I'm sure this resonates with people from other heavily regulated industries, is that you will get that every 3 months, you get that email in your inbox, which will make your heart sink, which is you are due to do your quarterly compliance check. And it will be this raft of quizzes and tests and, and they were always really badly designed. And I think and I'd be completely honest about this now, I don't work in the industry anymore. There was very little learning on compliance to happen because all I would do is try and game and cheat. Yeah. You would say, okay, well, what's the lowest possible score I can pass with? Do I even need to watch for training first? Like a lot of them just have a skip straight to quiz button, which, people will just do, and they won't even watch for training. And they'll be like, can I remember this from last time? Or can I bluff my heuristic for this was pick the most boring answer. And I would say 75% of the time that passed me and I'd learned nothing.
Right.
And I think there's a real branding problem here. There's a real issue with the way these courses are delivered, this training is delivered, because it's almost seen as everyone almost accepts that it's a chore. And it's like, ooh. And I think starting out from that position with such low expectations is really an uphill battle to kind of create any kind of quality.
Yeah, well, the counter argument to that is when you start with super low expectations on the part of your target audience, anything you do actually has a disproportionately positive impact. So imagine 100 is the perfect training course and I'm delivering you a 5 out of 100. If I can get it to 10, right, that is the difference there is way better, both mathematically, but also in terms of how I feel about it, than somebody who's delivering a 90% and knocks it up to 95. So that's the first piece. I think the second thing is the way this is approached starts from a very simple premise, which is to say that actually we're the organization and we know what's good for this organization. And so what we're going to do is we are going to deliver the objective that we have. And so if you look at particularly regulatory pieces, but this applies to a broader context of things the organization wants to communicate to you. You get a new regulation that comes in. So what the company does, somebody in the company goes, we need to make sure that we're compliant. So what we'll do is we'll transcribe the regulation into a policy. I mean, literally as close as we can. And then we can put that there. And then we can say we are 100% compliant because we have a policy that mirrors the regulation. Very logical. And then what we do to make sure that everybody understands the policy is we do training on the policy. Mm-hmm. Now, at no point has the person writing the regulation thought, I wonder how I make this user-friendly and engaging for people on the ground, right? They are looking at it from a regulator's perspective, which is this is what we need firms to do. And so you go through this process where the person at the end of it sits there and is basically being given a history lecture on the regulation. They're being asked dumb questions about failure to comply with this will see you go to jail for 5, 10, 15 or 20 years. Now, that's not a relevant question for anybody because you don't want someone sitting there going, oh, this one's only a 5-year jobby, so I'll break that rule. The other one's 20 years. I don't want to touch that. Right? It's utterly useless information. And so we're quizzing people on theory that, sure, have a policy that mirrors the regulation, because that's what you need, so that when you are inspected, you can pull the thing off the dusty shelf and go, look, it's all written down here. You're kind of ticking the box. But if you want people on the ground to understand what it is they need to do, you need to speak their language. You need to talk to them about realistic situations. The classic one I see in banking often is you get a piece of training that's money laundering training. I should emphasize it's anti-money laundering, but they often call it money laundering training, which I think is great.
I'm having flashbacks.
All right. And you said that, and you sort of said that. So question number, and what they've done is they've thought a little bit about it. So they thought a little bit, they've gone, we must create scenarios to make this real for people. And then the scenario is you are in a meeting with your client. And the clunky ones have sort of pictures and of course they perfect diverse picture grouping of people, and you sort of sit there and go, and the brother of your client has come in with a suitcase full of money. What do you do? Now you sit there and go, I can see what this is, right? This is a sort of let's teach them to suck eggs, basic thou shalt not murder type training. And what I love about it is everybody gets the right answer. And a few people for a laugh will hit the wrong one. And if you can't get the right answer to that question, you're an idiot who shouldn't be employed, right? So you do this thing. And what message does that send to people? Well, the answer is either we think you're a bunch of idiots, or this is about covering our backsides, and we are going to be able to say that we put everybody through. It doesn't help anybody navigate a real world situation, because it genuinely, if you're sat in a client meeting and someone rocks up with a suitcase full of money, even the most naive new kid on the block is going to go, this feels a bit weird. Maybe I should do something. And yet that's what they pick these extreme examples, which they think are helpful to make a point. And so what they're doing is talking about the black and the white of rules. None of us needs help managing the black and white. We need help in the gray zone, the bits where there's nuance, where we might not recognize a risk, where, actually there's a high opportunity for us to get legged over because we're tired and we're not thinking and blah, blah. And they never focus on that. They focus on those extremities. And so we're teaching people about a set of rules that don't speak to the realities of their world. And then we wonder why, but they went on the training and we wonder why they don't get it. And my favorite analogy on this one is if you think about a car, right? The way cars are designed is so the average driver can get into a car, provided you've passed your test and a bit of experience, you can get into a car and you can generally make it move. Now, you might put the indicator on instead of the windscreen wipers or vice versa, or do some, or the funny little light might appear, you don't recognize. But broadly speaking, you've got an idea of what's going on because it's been designed around the driver. But if you do have a problem, what you can do is go to something called the driver's manual, which they give you in the glove compartment. And the driver's manual is structured around you. So it's not written in technical terms. It's written in language you understand. It's which bit of the vehicle is doing something weird. What do all these symbols mean? How do I solve your problem? It's structured around you. There's a second document that exists, which is the engineering manual, which tells you how the damn thing works. And if you want to pull it apart, this is what you need to do. That is not given to consumers when they buy a car because you don't need it. And yet the way most of the training operates in organizations is, stop. Before you can drive the car, you need to do mandatory training on the engineering manual because then we'll know you understand it. And so I just say that, they don't do that in that context. So why do we think it's smart to do it in a work context? And a lot of my shtick is saying to people, think about whether if you did this in another context, you would get the result you want. And if the answer to that is no, why do you think that just because it's an employment contract that's governing your relationship, or they've walked into a building you own or logged onto a system that you control, that somehow that human being, which by the way, you've probably spent a lot of time and money hiring because of their brilliance as a human being, particularly in the knowledge economy. What are you doing here? You're basically, and it creates cognitive dissonance amongst all of us. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we need to wean people off this idiotic process because it looks great. Auditors love it. Apologies to any auditors on, but I think auditors also are doing the devil's work because they are creating audit recommendations that encourage this sort of behavior. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. And so I look at it and say, let's just step back and say, if we were to do this in another context, right, would people laugh at us? Would we think it's real? And if so, we need to have a really good reason to override that, because in both cases, we're talking to human beings and we're trying to influence their behavior.
If you were to kind of get rid of everything, as in like get rid of all the regulations, get rid of all the compliance stuff that exists.
It sounds like the UK government's COVID policy.
Yeah, pretty much. So if you're in the UK government doing COVID policy, how would you do it differently? Like if you could just start again, is there a way you could actually just make it basically work better?
I think what we need to do is to recognize. And look, there are some rules that are nothing to do with influencing people's behavior on an ongoing basis, right? You might be setting a rule to say, if you are designing X, design it in this way, right? So if you're architect, there are certain principles, health and safety type principles where don't build a building. So you are influencing human decision-making, but it's in an isolated incident when they do. So those may be slightly different. But if we're looking at the sort of ongoing day-to-day, how you want to behave type rules, one of the things that we don't do is think carefully about the outcome that we're looking for. And we tend to equate, if you look at a rule book, we tend to think of all of those rules as sort of the same thing, right? It's a list of things we need to do. But they're actually very, very different. So some of the rules will be things you want people to do all of the time. Some of the things are things you never want anybody to do ever. And some of them are things that you need them to do for the right reasons in the right circumstances. So if I looked at that and said, what does that mean from a risk perspective? Well, things I want people to do all of the time might be ethical. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Well, how do we define ethics? So we've got to think about the fact that that's a very general term that might not resonate with people and that will be open to interpretation. I've got things I don't want anybody to ever do. So I don't want people committing fraud. So very clear red lines there. Now, the way I approach those two things will be very different because telling you to do something that's open to interpretation is very different to telling you not to do something that's probably not open to interpretation. And then I've got things like recycling is my favorite example, but maybe COVID vaccines would be a better one, where I would love everybody to do it, but I can recognize it's not realistic to make it mandatory because I can't enforce it, I can't control it, I can't observe it. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at that sort of requirement, maybe I need to use different levers in that sort of situation. And then we might look at the context and say, actually, there are certain contexts in which things are significant that are not significant in others. So food safety, nuclear power, anything that's kind of got human life attached to it, there are certain things that there's no negotiation whatsoever. Under no circumstances do X. And therefore, it's perfectly okay for me to treat people like small children. So, and nobody working in the food industry should complain about the fact that they're asked to wash their hands on a regular basis, even outside COVID, right? Very important basic. Nuclear power industry or airline safety. I don't want people getting a bit, wonder what happens if I press this, right? Not the kind of mindset that we want to be encouraging. Now, that's very different to talking to salespeople about being ethical and how we frame that. And so the guidance and help that people need will very much depend on the situation they're in, it'll depend on their experience. And we need to think about these things. And so what I would be saying is each time we create a rule, we create a requirement, we write a sign, we create a training course, any of these attempts to influence human decision-making, we need to be working out what behaviors are we trying to drive, and not just thinking about that, but also what does this mean from the perspective of the target audience? So I can sit there and say, well, it's very logical that I need everybody to do this. If they don't get it and they don't understand why it matters, then you're onto a losing streak here because they're not going to do it. You also need to factor in how they feel about it. And so we need to look at, do I think you have authority in this field? And we see this with employers, for example, with control over your personal social media. Mm-hmm. Now, you could say, if I work for the security services, I kind of get the fact that they're not going to want me being on social media, or at least if they are, it's going to be tightly controlled. And if I work for myself, as I do now, right, I manage my own risk. But most companies, you're somewhere in between the two. So can you say to people, because you might cause us a risk that you cannot have any presence on social media, that feels a little bit like overstepping the mark when my job, like if I'm a celebrity, if I'm being paid to endorse a product, maybe there's a different set, but there'll be different rules in different situations. So we need to reflect on how do they feel about that. And so if we start to dissect all of those requirements and thinking about what do we think, what do they think, what will resonate, what experience do they have, is this genuinely common sense, or is this something where the risk might not be obvious to them? Dissect all of that stuff and you can start to design things that will meet that actual need. Now, that sounds like a lot of work, and it probably is conceptually, but practically speaking, we kind of know if there's a new regulation that comes out that's not obvious to everybody, that's confusing as hell, then that's a different thing to a sort of thou shalt not murder type rule that we all kind of go, I understand why that is there, I will. And we need to balance those things out. And so I think this requires, particularly in the knowledge economy, a much more intelligent engagement by people. And so I would be starting to say, you go through every single thing you have written down, every single thing you require, and do that analysis. Because if you don't do that, I mean, there's some stuff you can probably ignore, it might be, but if you don't start to think in those terms, that's when you're going to crystallize risk.
Mm-hmm. So going back to rogue traders, we talked about rogue traders very early on, and we kind of not skip the topic, but we talked about it very briefly. And I suppose perhaps the most famous rogue trader of my generation was
I'm always intrigued as to where people go with this.
Nick Leeson.
Yes, right.
Sorry, it took me. I almost said Liam Neeson, but he played him in the film, didn't he? But so
no, that was you. That was Ewan McGregor.
Was it Ewan McGregor? Sorry, I apologise.
With huge apologies to the Leeson family, because having watched another one of his movies, he's got specialist skills, right? So he's not a guy that I'm going to be irritating.
I know who you are. I will make you
right, exactly. No. If he's a member of your club, you're toast, right?
So, Nick Leeson, extreme bad actor within, I think it was Bearings, so extreme, such a tail risk that he actually was an existential risk to the organization. It caused them to collapse. I'm trying to think what my question will be. How can compliance help with behavioral science and compliance help with such extreme bad actors that no amount of nudging or training?
Right. So I think the narrative there that the framing you've put around this is interesting, because you've basically just said to me, here's a bad guy doing bad things. And that is how we are brought up to think about these things. So if you go back to childhood, like something like, let's take Harry Potter as an example, right? There's some very clear black and white characters there. It's good about, and occasionally we have slightly morally dubious, not quite sure where they stand. But bottom line is we are taught this simple thing. So one of the reasons that we have problems, I think, in the human risk space is that there is this narrative of when bad things happen, it is always bad people doing bad things. Now, sometimes that is absolutely true. But I would contend in the rogue trading space, it's less likely to be true, because to be honest, if you were going to try and commit bad, that wouldn't be your best route. Your best route is to go through a sort of fraud route, as opposed to trying to breach limits and find alternative courses. So if anyone's watching for careers advice, there you go.
You heard it here first, guys.
But what typically happens with rogue traders in the psychology isn't that they start off going, how can I game the system? But what happens, and the narrative that gets in the press is always about, here's someone who's trying to inflate, and it's normally his bonus. And here's an greedy so-and-so. But actually, if you look at what tends to happen, it's they have screwed up somewhere along the line. Mm-hmm. And they don't start out by taking these mega bets. What they do is they start out by making small bets. And typically what you see is that they've incurred some losses. They don't know what to do with that situation. They're scared of losing their job. So what they do is they do what they're trained to do, right? Which is trade their way out of trouble. And they have the skills to be able to do that. So if you look at Leeson, if you look at Kerviel, if you look at Adeboli, all of them, it's not suddenly they got themselves in this big position. There's stuff that's happened before. And in most cases, what's happened is something's gone wrong. And in order to keep their job, what they've done is they've traded their way out of trouble. So they have effectively done what the velociraptors do at the start of Jurassic Park, right, which is testing the fences. So they've clocked that there's a weakness in this system. And many of them don't kind of continue on that until circumstances put them in a position where they need to rely on that skill. So it's not, I think, driven by greed. I think it's driven by greed to the extent of I want to keep my job, but I would argue that's an incentive all of us have. It's driven by I've kind of got an emergency parachute if I need it. So if I get myself into a bit of trouble, I know how to get out of this because I've worked out there's a weakness in the system. And you then see that kind of manifesting itself. And of course, they go for it because they can, and they find all sorts of rationale to go for it. And of course, if those bets come off, they're doing really, really, really well. And so what you see here is, I think, a natural human reaction to a set of circumstances where it's impossible to put your hand up if you've screwed up. And so my number one lesson to organizations would be to say, look, if you don't have a mechanism whereby someone who's screwed up can come forward, you are missing the opportunity for them to come forward when it's a small problem. And so language like zero tolerance feels like a really, lots of CEOs we have zero tolerance for X. And I think there are things you should have zero tolerance for. So we don't want bullying, sexism, racism, all those kinds of things. But we also need to accept the fact that human beings will screw up. And you need to have a path back for the redemptive sinner who wants to find themselves back. And there's a fascinating example that I've come across from the airline industry, where what they do, certainly historically, I don't know if it's still the case, but this comes with a regulatory regime that supports it, which is this idea that if you're air crew, and I presume it probably applies across the organization because you wouldn't necessarily want to have different rules, but if you're air crew and you come forward and say, I have a drug problem, what they will do is they will help you get rehab. And the aim of that rehab is to get you back into the sky. Now, that sounds terrifying from a customer perspective. You go, I don't want some reform. What will they do in the toilet? Something. But actually, it makes a lot of sense because if you think about it from the perspective of the air crew, what incentive is there to come forward if coming forward equals I'm going to lose my job? Yeah. And so they want to build this structure where people can come back. And I think the rogue trader thing is, and there will be people who find examples that disprove my point, but the rogue trader thing, I think, is basically if we could find a path for people to come back. And you might go, do you know what, you've really gone too far, but at least the stakes wouldn't be as high. Then I think you would have less of that going on. And one of the things I think is fascinating about this zero tolerance mindset is that if we create those strong lines, then you better be really clear that there aren't circumstances under which someone could accidentally slip over that line. Because if you create those very strong lines, once you're on the wrong side of the line and you feel there is no way back, you might as well keep going. So crass example would be if you say, well, the death penalty kicks in if you've murdered one person. Hey, you might as well go on a killing spree because what can happen? And so if you're going to lose your job or you're going to go to jail, what incentive is there on you to come forward? And I do think we need to think about the psychological piece there. The other benefit of thinking in those terms is if you give people a path to admit they've screwed up, if you give them an exit route, if you've made it as simple as possible to comply, what you've actually then done is isolated the people that are wrong-uns who are actively trying to do that, as opposed to having them in a larger group of people where some of the people that have made mistakes are genuinely, I screwed up and I was tired, I misread the rules, it's a genuine, honest mistake. So this zero tolerance thing groups all those people together. And then psychologically, well, I might as well join the bad guys because I'm being accused of being one. Now, there is, of course, a line that you need because you wouldn't want somebody going, I accidentally found myself incurring losses of 50 million and I've put my hand up now, right? So you need to calibrate it at some level. But I do think there is this incredible primitive simplicity where we don't think about some of these. What is it like for the person going through this experience? And sure, of course, the argument then is always, well, you're giving people a loophole. But if you think about the percentage of people that are actually setting out to cause you damage in your organization, that's a very small percent. It's probably 1%, maybe more, but it's not going to be a massive amount of people. And what we tend to do is we focus on those people. And so we write training programs, we write policies, procedures around stopping that. What we don't think about is the impact it has on everybody else. So my favorite, I talked a lot to lawyers about this. And they say, what we need to do is have all these processes because annual attestation is a good example, right? I need to make sure everybody signed this annual attestation so that if they do something wrong, we can fire them. And that's great when you come to fire that wrong. And at the one person who's really bad, perfect, helps the lawyers massively. What they don't consider is the fact you're pissing off 99% of the population because you're sending a signal that we don't trust you. And you're saying, I'm going to put you in a position now where you need to sign a piece of paper that we will be able to use against you, oh criminal employee, when you do something wrong. Yeah. But that's invisible. So you see the court case that happens. You don't see the invisible stuff that's going on. And that cost on employees who will look at you and go, you don't trust me. This is a joke. It's a complete waste of time. And therefore, that has an impact on them. And I think that's how we need to start reflecting on these things. Now, I'm not saying we cut everybody a ton of slack, and if you've got someone doing awful things that you let them off because, hey, we're all human. But we do need to think about where we balance that. And what bothers me is the thought process I've just gone through, which isn't necessarily the right analysis, never happens. Right? You get these edicts from the CEO, everybody will do this. And somebody needs to take them aside and go, whoa, 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 whoa. As ever with interventions as humans, right, there are effects, and we can debate whether the term side effects makes sense or not, but there are effects, intended effects and unintended effects, and we often don't focus on those unintended ones.
Okay, so we've had quite a few questions come in, so I can't believe we're already 45 minutes in, and we've sort of got 15 minutes left. This has been fantastic, but the time's just gone so quickly. Okay, so I'm gonna go for a few of these and fire away. But have you ever had to deal with malicious compliance? So I think this is where, correct me if I'm wrong, where someone is sort of deliberately being over compliant, either through malice or.
Yeah. Okay. I thought it was like bad actors in compliance. Yeah, they exist, right? People that go into compliance to work out where to break the rules. But hey, so yes, totally. So one of the things to watch when you've got people inquiring about your rules and policies is that I have a very simple analysis here. So if there's lots of inquiries about a particular policy, there are two reasons people ask you about a policy. The first one is they genuinely want to know what they're allowed to do or not. The second one is they try to game it and work out where the limits of the things are. And so I've had tons of examples of people going, one of my staff had a question about what happens if, right? And you kind of know, right? It's not hypothetical, and it's not about a member of staff, and it's already happened, right? So yeah. And one of the this is a perverse metric, right? Have a look if you're responsible for any rules. Have a look at a particularly digital format. It's great because you can see who's looking at rules. And if somebody is looking at your policies, I draw two conclusions. Either they are investigating closely to find out where the line is, or it's massively unclear and you need to do something about it. Either way, that's a really useful indicator.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna go on to slightly rapid fire mode here.
Yeah, I'll try and be quicker.
I realise I've overrun a little bit. So is it better to motivate behaviour through financial incentive or disincentive?
It's a carrot or stick, basically. You need to think about both, right? They're both equally valid, but I prefer, we always go straight for those. What we need to do is think about alternative things, right? So things like behavioral contagion. Think about this in the context of COVID, right? And we had this question about, do we bribe people to get vaccinated? Is a good example of that. There are other ways that you can do it. And so there is no simple answer. But one of the things I see, people dive straight for those because that's what we know. We know that's kids growing up, right? That's what parents do. They punish us or they bribe us. There are tons of other behavioral things we can get to before we get to those. And I would say those are last resort because those are obvious, right? Those that you are saying to the people you're trying to influence, right? Hey, I'm using this thing or that thing. If you can do it subtly so people are complying with what you want without even realizing it, then that's much more powerful. And then you can save those things for the things that really matter where you have no other choice.
So you would say that kind of financial incentive or disincentive, is last resort too strong a word? Or
no, they're very powerful. But here's the thing: they're very powerful. They work in a manner that means the person knows that you're doing it, right? We're sentient. We respond. We understand what's going on. So we know that if we've been bribed to do something once, that then becomes the acceptable currency for doing it again, and that supersedes any other reason for doing it. So you know that if you bribe your kids because you clean your bedroom and I'll give you this. Right, that then becomes the norm. Right, you have nowhere else you can, and in fact, the price is probably going to go up, right? Because they get smarter about it. So I think the problem with those is you're declaring your hand, and if you have to, and sometimes you have to, but if you declare your hand, it's very difficult to move to an alternative mechanism. So I would encourage people to exercise those alternative ones, and then keep that in reserve because it is super powerful, but it's blindingly obvious. And never forget, whatever you're doing to other people, they will probably recognize what's going on, right? And they will be able to infer what your true motivations are. And I think very often organizations go, we'll get them this way, right? And sometimes that can be very, very effective, but you have to be very careful about it. So I try and ward people off those, because once you're into that space, it's difficult to go elsewhere.
Fantastic.
Quick question for me.
Sorry, was that too quick? I sense we've slowed down a bit. I should have edited it out. Getting my producer's voice in my ear. Go longer on.
yeah. Pat out. No. I saw this phrase you used. I don't know if it's just something offhand or not, but you used this phrase somewhere, human risk bubble. And it just stuck out to me. I was just wondering if you could explain what that means. It sounded interesting.
Oh, did I?
Maybe maybe it's the wrong question to ask.
That's interesting.
Make it up on the spot.
Was this on a podcast, Seb, or was this?
I'm not sure where I saw it.
That's really interesting. I'm not something I've consciously used. I'll fire another one at me and I'll think about that, but that's not something that resonates with me immediately. I probably said it. It's probably a brilliant point, and it'll occur to me 2 minutes after we finish.
Whoever came up with that was a genius.
Yeah. I love it. It's incredibly sophisticated point, but I don't know. That's great, right? Always. I love it. Before we went live, I remember saying, like, if you don't know something in the current climate, it feels like weakness to go, I don't know. And we see, politicians are prime examples of that. I'm really confident going, I have no idea. And I'm not even the least bit embarrassed, but I'll tell you what, I'll go dig it out. If it's a brilliant point, I will shout about it afterwards. If it's terrible, you'll never hear it again.
I like that. We've got a question about your podcast. So
it's amazing. It's an incredible thing, right?
I've got to say, I'm gonna preface this with, I'm a fan of Christian's podcast. One thing that strikes me about it is, well, there are a few things. There's some absolutely amazing guests on there. They really, really are. And I can't tell you how much I enjoy the guests on this podcast. But the thing that struck me about it is, if you go back to the very first episode you did, the production quality is so good. Like a lot of podcasts, you can see they kind of start out as a bit of a hobby, and the production value increases over time. You really started it with a really high production quality.
Oh wow!
I was really impressed with.
That's very kind. Somebody once told me that you should never look back on your early drafts, incarnations of things, and be proud of them. Like, you should be embarrassed because you've got so much better. And I look back on some of those episodes and I go, I was like, the guests I get, you're right. I managed to get some amazing people with some really interesting things, and sort of it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to have them. And I make a firm thing of I don't pay anyone to be on the show. It's just they're doing it out of the goodwill. Now, if they've got a book to promote or something, it's a little bit easier to get than if they haven't. But it's funny that the podcast is really interesting, and it gives you a little bit of a reveal into my psyche. So I started humanriskpodcast.com, by the way, for anyone that's not come across this joy of thing. But I started it purely because, and this was pre-lockdown in 2019, and I was like, I must have a podcast. So I'd set up the company and I literally just went, I must have a podcast. No clue. And I've always had this secret ambition to be a sort of radio host. And I'd never done anything with it. And if I recorded a demo tape while I was kind of just out of university with an aim to, and I never sent it to anyone. Pathetic. So anyway, I started this podcast with no real ambition beyond I'm going to have some conversations and get some interesting people. And I started to do it. And what's fascinating, I really shouldn't say this, but I will. I would still do the podcast even if no one listened to it, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say until I explain why, which is, firstly, it's a brilliant exercise for me because you can't just jump into that. You have to prepare for it. So it forces me to. And this is the behavioral science bit I love most of all. If I were to email the people that I get on the show and say, can I have an hour's worth of conversation? A large swathe of them would understandably tell me to get stuffed. Because who am I? If you say, would you like to come onto my podcast, which is the same thing, magically it becomes an acceptable thing. So framing, good example of where framing matters. And so that's powerful in itself. Then I get to learn as I have these conversations, and it's quite stressful sometimes because the format is free form. So I don't have I hate those things where it's like, I have 20 questions and I know you've just said something really interesting, but I need to ask question number 4 because that's what it says on my list. I'm like, we'll just go wherever. And part of the reason I'm having this sort of hour-long format is to meander and go to strange places. And I want the guest almost to come away going, wow, I've never said that. Or I never thought, maybe they've used a phrase like human risk bubble and they've gone, wow, that's incredible. I will know. And so I love, I want them to have some positive engagement. And then of course, the other benefit is to me is that then I'm associated with that guest and they promote it. So you get the social proof and all those things off the back of it. And it's, it becomes a work. And so I have lots of, when I talk to clients, people go, I love the podcast. It's a great opener because they know my voice. And frankly, if they still want to talk to me after listening to it, then that's a pretty good sign. But no, it's a labor of love. I kind of do it fun, and I just let my curiosity take the hold of me and see who I can get and stray into some interesting territories. And it seems to resonate with people. So thank you for those comments. I'd love it if anybody else wanted to join the gang listening. And look, the other thing is, it's not a series where I expect I'm the only person I think that's listened to every single episode. Even my mum hasn't, but it's, I dive in around. So there'll be some things that appeal to people because it's more compliancy. There's some sport related ones. I've got a guy talking about human factors in diving. And that coming on the show very soon. So I try and find, my favorite flagship one was the sexologist, who I just literally tweeted. She put something on Facebook as we were talking about mask wearing last year. That was, if you want to get people to wear masks, talk to a sexologist. And the reason was that actually the things that you use to persuade people to wear condoms to prevent the spread of HIV is highly relevant to wearing masks. Sounds ridiculous until you think about the fact that mask wearing interrupts a natural process and looks a bit weird. Wearing condoms also interrupts a natural process. And in fact, it's easier to get people to wear masks because that's a visible activity. You can see it in public, as opposed to the other one, which generally shouldn't be a public activity. And you're probably in a slightly more engaged moment, shall we say, if you're looking at condoms. But it was fast. And what she'd done is she'd done the logical, well, actually, I can see these parallels. And so we had a conversation where I dissected she'd talk about what she was thinking. And I was like, well, that's interesting because here's the behavioral science angle on it. And so she's an example of, I'm looking for interesting insights into what drives human decision-making, how we can manage human risk. And they come sometimes from bizarre places.
That's awesome. I think that covers I hadn't actually asked the question, which was, what is your most memorable podcast guest? But I think you've actually covered that with the sexologist.
I'll tell you who the biggest surprise was. It's a guy called Glenn Medeiros, who viewers of a certain age may remember. So he had a mega hit, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, which was a cover version of George Benson's Nothing Gonna Change My Love for You. And so he's this teen idol in Hawaii. And I was literally having dinner with some friends, and we'd sort of always joked about it. And it was like one of those, whatever happened to blah, blah, blah conversations. And his name came up somehow. And I just kind of, in a slightly under the influence moment, well, I'm going to get him on the podcast to find out. And I did some research. And it turns out he's now basically the principal at a college. And he's gone and got a PhD and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, so anyway, I approached him and I thought he's never going to say yes. Well, yeah, and there's quite a few people. I always try, right? Because you never know, right? And he said, yeah. He sort of came back and said yes. And I was like, oh, God. I've not got to do this. Shit. But I was like, what the hell, right? I'll do it. And he turned out to be the most amazing guy, so self-aware. He talked about recording with print. There's a ton of really interesting anecdotes about the music industry and how he, as a naive person, had come into that and the way they manipulate you and manage you and the experiences he's had. And I was just like, the guy is so smart, so insightful, and so intelligent. And so what had started out as a slightly entertaining, let's see if we can get him on the show, turned out, full of insights about the music industry. And so that one I'm really proud of because it literally came from just let's see if this can happen. And so I always try those. Needless to say, not many of them come off. And a ton of people ask to get paid. And I'm like, I'm not playing that game. But sometimes it does come off. And that, so I would say Glenn is right up there, along with a ton of other people. The Rory Sutherland and the rest of the people that have also come on.
I will definitely take inspiration from you and maybe be a bit more daring with these live Q&As then and go for it. All right, I think we've got time for one last question. I think we can sneak in. I think
I've got a question. If you,
no, please.
Unless you found a particularly good one.
I still haven't worked out what the bubble is, by the way. But
maybe next time you can explain it. I was just thinking back to what you're saying about, financial incentives and disincentives. And you were talking about actually, before you even get to the carrot and stick thing, you want to see if you can influence people's behavior almost without them knowing it. And I was just wondering what you think about the ethics of doing that. Ethics of nudging, essentially.
I think this is really interesting because clearly we have to consider that. And it's perfect. As with, I always use the analogy of cars, right? You can use a car to take emergency supplies to someone, to take someone to hospital, or you can use it to drive someone over, or to get to a bank robbery, or to get away from bank robbery. Much better example. Right? Don't use it to get there and go, I'm sure I had a way of getting at it. But so I look at behavioral science a little bit as a tool for good or for bad, and it's your choice as to how you want to play that. The other bit I think is important to remember is, of course, behavioral science isn't something you switch on, right? You are trying to influence people, whether you know it or not, all of the time. So every conversation that we have is in some way, shape, or form an attempt to influence people. So I don't look at it as something that I'm suddenly switching on, because if I've got an architecture in place, I've already made some conscious, or sort of maybe some subliminal decisions about how that operates. And so I think it's really important not just to think about it when we're doing it knowingly using behavioral science, but actually go back and say, anytime we try and do that, we should be thinking about it, particularly where there is information asymmetry, i.e. you know more about it than your target audience does. And I think it is absolutely critical. So when I talk to people about it, I factor that in and say, start with that basic principle of fairness. And I don't define what that means, because it's really difficult. Because if you're talking about small children, you can do stuff with kids because they just don't know. And if you said to them, do you think this is reasonable? Of course, they're going to go, no, right? What do you mean? I don't want to go to bed. That's incredibly, and they will use words like unfair. So I think that there may be situations where people don't know. And I think this is interesting when it comes to risk situations, where if the target audience, if you can't possibly expect them to understand or compute the risks, that's a different scenario to one where it's reasonable for them to expect them to know that. So we have to balance those things out. And of course, if you ask people what they think is fair, sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes it's incredibly unhelpful, because actually you are doing it for reasons that might be outside their wherewithal, their understanding. So for me, it's incredibly important, not just when I'm doing something new, but to think back to what I'm doing before. And one of the things that's fascinating is people do say, well, that's not fair, that's manipulation. And then I come back to the point of, well, you're already doing something along those lines. So have you assessed what you're doing now under the criterion that you're asking me to apply to the new things? And if the answer is no, well, then we should do both at the same time. We should look at both those things. For some reason, it seems to apply to newfangled ideas. It's not necessarily applied to the older ones, but I think it's absolutely critical, because otherwise you will end up like those businesses, the tourist businesses that rip you off once and they get away with it because they don't have the same people coming back. My view is, if you want a sustained relationship with the people that you're targeting, particularly if they're your employees, then you need to be thinking about that critically. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Well, I mean, as always, the time has gone far too quickly. We're at the end of our hour. We'd love to have you here for hours and hours. Before we wrap up, Christian, one thing we always ask all of our guests, is there anything, kind of final comments you want to, do you want to plug anything? Do you want to mention anything? Is there anything you want to talk about in particular?
Yeah, so look, podcast we've done to death, so thank you for that. Human-risk.com. Feel free. I love connecting with people on social media, so anybody who wants to connect, please do that. I try and put content out that is thought-provoking or irritating or enjoyable, whatever. So just connect with me. I think that my number one message is, I think we very often don't think about the people that we're trying to influence. So when we get this wrong, we presume that somehow we have a right to do it. So we're employing them, therefore we can tell them what to do. We know better than them, all those sorts of things. And I think sometimes that is valid, right? Kids is the best example, but very often it might not be. And I love it. And particularly in a polarized world, I think it's really important to start seeing other people's perspective more. So what's fascinating for me at the moment is trying to get myself into other people's minds. All of that said, there are some people that are frankly idiots who deserve to be ignored, who should never be listened to, and we shouldn't respect. And I worry about this. We see this on UK TV. We've got, let's have an expert on the virus, and then let's have some pop star that thinks it's a crap idea who read some stuff on Wikipedia. And that's so I temper these things slightly. But for me, I worry hugely that we're not spending enough time thinking about what other people think and why they're thinking it. And if we did that, we could have a nicer, better world. So there we go.
Awesome. It's like that is a very nice meditation to finish on, I think. Well, listen, Christian, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been so cool having you here. I know, a lot of the Fat Tony's community, there's a lot of love for behavioral science in this community. And I know they found this really, really interesting. This is going to be on YouTube, obviously other than the live stream. It's going to be there for people to watch. It's going to be on the Fat Tony's website, Fat Tony's Discord channel. But, I guess from me, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you for daring to invite me and allowing me to spout forth. It's been great. And I love the questions. I'm still working out what the human risk bubble is, and if it isn't something, I'm going to make it something. So look out for that.
Awesome. I look forward.
I can't wait.
All right. Thank you very much, Christian. And
Thank you.
Care.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're off the stream.
I honestly don't know what that is. I love it.